Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to all of you who've joined us, whether from across the UK or across the Atlantic. I'm delighted to have such a large crowd, and I hope the next 90 minutes gives us a real positive surge of energy to end our day here in the UK. I'm Helen Gilded. I run the Young Foundation, a national charity based in the East End of London, with a really long track record of supporting social and community-led innovation. And our belief in the need for a more communitarian culture, our belief in young people, in the value of a strong civil society, and a belief that the problems that we face are better faced together are the reasons that we've invited Bob and Shaylyn to talk with us today. And I'm really delighted to have them with us to this Institute for Community Studies event. And I wanted to just firstly express our deep gratitude for taking time to share the insights from their new book, The UpSwing: How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. So Bob Putnam will be a name that's known to many of you. He's the professor of public policy at Harvard University, and among many other things, he's a corresponding fellow of the British Academy and a past president of the American Political Science Association. Among many, many accolades, Bob has received the National Humanities Medal, the highest honor in the US for contributions to the humanities, and that was delivered to him by President Obama. He's written 15 books translated into 20 languages. His wisdom is much in demand, and he's advised many previous American presidents and British prime ministers. I'm also really delighted and equally hugely will give a big warm welcome to our co-author of the UpSwing, Shaylyn Romney Garrett. Shaylyn holds a BA in government from Harvard University and is a founding contributor to the work of the David Brooks Aspen Institute. Shaylyn is also a successful social entrepreneur in her own right, founding Think Unlimited, a venture working to catalyze social innovation in the Middle East. Her work is featured in Fast Company, the New York Times, Harvard Business Review, among many, many others, and she's twice been awarded membership of the Clinton Global Initiative. Suffice to say that these are two brilliant people who've authored a brilliant book based on a really energizing hypothesis, and that is that America has seen some extremely difficult times in its history. And if we look to what created the upswing out of those extremely difficult, unequal times of huge political division, we might find inspiration for our own collective upswing. Now, the work that Bob and Shaylyn are going to set out shortly is an analysis of 20th century US history. And with the inauguration of a new president in a midst of a very long pandemic with much civic upheaval in the US, it would be really tempting to locate our conversation wholly in America and in US political culture and society. I really wanted us to think quite deeply and deliberately about what the book means in a UK context too. And so we've asked a number of people after Bob and Shaylyn's talk to offer their reflections on this. What do the central messages of the upswing mean for the UK? How are we thinking of our own upswing or building back better, or any of the other words that seek to emphasize a need to generate positive momentum to increase wealth, community, and well-being across this country? Where should we be focusing our efforts, and whose energy will really propel us forward? So please give a really incredibly warm virtual Zoom welcome to Bob Putnam and Shaylyn Romney Garrett. Welcome to you both.
Thanks very much, Helen. It's a real treat and honor, actually, to be with you and your guests today. As you know, I've spent a lot of time in England over the last 50 years, and I know very well who Michael Young is, and I know what your institution means in the UK, and so it's genuinely a treat. As you say, we're going to be talking mostly about America, but we're also familiar with the UK situation, and I'm going to try to restrain myself from turning this into a talk about the UK, because there are lots of interesting parallels between what has happened in the past in the UK and what's happened in America's past. But I'm going to restrain myself and let the English, or British, forgive me, the British implications of our work come from your conversations. I want to say one more thing as a kind of a prefatory note, we're in the midst, America is in the midst right now of a big crisis. And therefore one is tempted to, this whole discussion is very tempting to carry into what's going to happen, what has just happened yesterday and what's literally going to happen tomorrow in America. You have to keep in mind, this book was actually written at the publishers more than a year ago now. So the book itself did not know we were going to have a pandemic, did not know we were going to have an enormous economic crisis, did not know that we were going to have extreme polarization and the events of January 6th and so on. And we're delighted to talk about that, but we're going to begin not by talking about today's events or yesterday's events. We're going to begin by talking about the big, wider historical perspective. And then we're going to move directly in the question and answer period, and to some extent in Shaylyn's presentation, about what the implications of our 125-year historical view is for issues facing the US and maybe also the UK going forward. So if we have the next slide, I want to this is where I'm beginning. The fact is, America today has reached historic levels of political polarization, arguably the most polarized time in American history. The only rival of that actually is the Civil War. So it's a big deal. Independently of that, historic levels of economic inequality, again, probably close to being the most unequal America has ever been in our national history, not as long as UK history, but still awfully long. And in addition to that, historic levels of social isolation, and finally of cultural self-centeredness, of narcissism, you might say. And so the question that we begin with is, how in the world did we get here? And I'm going to show you a couple of charts based on hard data. I'm not going to be talking mostly about numbers here, but I want to show you what the hard empirical evidence shows, so you don't think we're just blowing smoke here, about trends over the last 125 years in political polarization, economic inequality, social isolation, and cultural self-centeredness. So if we have the next slide, I'll begin with this slide. This one is about political polarization. The graphs are all going to look about, they're all going to have, roughly speaking, the same shape. And so let's look at, let's spend a little bit of time on this chart just so you know how to read them. The horizontal axis here runs from 1890 is when the data begin, 1895, over to 2020, to today. And so this shows that that's a kind of a picture of what America has been like in terms of our political relationships, our bipartisanship, polarization, or political comedy. All the charts are oriented so that up is good. So in this case, up means more political comity, or more political bipartisanship, or more political cooperation across party lines. And low means the opposite of that, high polarization. And you can see, starting over at the left-hand side of the chart at the bottom, America at the end of the 19th century was extremely polarized. That at that period, it was sort of the most polarized America had ever been, except for the Civil War. So we don't have the Civil War in this chart, but if we did, the Civil War, maybe 30 or 40 years earlier, had been, of course, a great period of polarization. But then was once again equally polarized in the 1890s. But you can see, coming out of the 1890s and 1900s, we began to become a little less polarized and began a steady upturn in the degree to which people worked across party lines steadily through the 30s and 40s and through the 50s and into the 60s. The peak point there is probably 1950, the middle 1950s, and people who know about American political history know that was when a man named Dwight Eisenhower was president, and he was probably the most nonpartisan or bipartisan president in American history. Actually, the least partisan president ever in our history is George Washington. But since then, Dwight Eisenhower in the middle 50s was that. And you can see there the dot showing how unpolarized our society was. I do not mean that Eisenhower caused it. I mean that Eisenhower reflected that period of a lot of cooperation across party lines. But then as we enter the 60s, and especially as we enter the 70s, America begins to become more polarized and more polarized. And pause for a second, around 1980, that's when Ronald Reagan comes into office, and people sometimes think that Ronald Reagan caused this polarization. But as you can see, we had already been going down towards more polarization 20 years before Reagan came in. So it wasn't just Reagan. It isn't any individual politician who caused this, but it kept going steadily down, 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 down through the 1990s and through the first 2 decades of the 21st century. And although our graph here ends in 2015, we know now what the data looked like for the last 5 years, and it's even more polarized. So if we extended that chart down to where we are right now at the beginning of 2021, it would be even lower, and for sure more polarized than we had been back in the 1890s, but close to as polarized as we had been at the time of our Civil War. So that's the pattern of what political polarization or political comedy looks like over this last 125 years. I'm not going to say so much about each of the succeeding slides because you now have the basic picture. If we go to the next slide, here we're talking about economic equality. Nominally, this is something completely different. The graph is on the same set of ordinates, but here we're talking about political equality. We're talking basically about the gap between rich and poor. And as you can see, at the beginning of the 20th century, the data only begin in 1913 because that's when we first start having good hard data. That's when our Internal Revenue Service was created and began to produce really hard data on the gap between rich and poor. And you can see that we were pretty unequal in 1910. Probably we had been even less equal back in the previous 10 or 15 years. But then beginning in around that decade, we begin to become more equal. We're still far from being equal, but we're moving in the direction of greater equality. There's a pause during the 1920s that is well known in American, and for that matter, British history. That's the Roaring '20s. But then coming out of the 1920s and into the 1930s, long before actually even before the Depression had hit and before the New Deal had begun, we began to have more and more equality. The gap between rich and poor was narrowing steadily in American life. And you can see it rose quite high in the 1940s. There's a little bit of a dip just after World War II, but then it keeps going up and greater equality. And it hits a peak, roughly speaking, around 1960. Now, of course, I do not mean that in 1960, America was some kind of utopian commune in which everybody had the same income. Of course not. But internationally speaking, at that point, America looked sort of like the Scandinavian countries, notorious for their equality. We were actually slightly more equal in the distribution of income in that period than Scandinavia was. But then, as you see, beginning around in 1960, we begin to become a little less equal. And that trend continues down, down, down. And again, it's been going down. There's where Reagan hits in 1980, but it's been going down for 20 years before, and it keeps going down, down, steadily down through Republican and Democratic administrations as we get down to around 2015, which was when this graph, the data here end. It looks like maybe it's leveling off, but again, we know what happened in the last 5 years, which is a massive increase in inequality. So it's plunged. The number would have, if we had the real data for the most recent 5 or 6 years, it would have gone down even further, more and more inequality, and we would have been back basically to where we were at the beginning of this 125-year cycle. So let's go to the next slide. Here we're going to be looking at social cohesion, the degree to which people are connected with one another, or what I, in an earlier book, called social capital. That is the degree to which people are connected with their family and friends and neighbors. And we put together here a variety of different measures, how close you are to your family and friends, how strong the family unit is, how much people are involved in community organizations, how often people are, how much they trust other people, how often they get involved in community organizations of various sorts. And you can see that was, for reasons that Shaylyn will shortly explain, at the end of the 19th century, we were actually quite low in social cohesion, quite isolated. But then again, beginning around 1900, we start to become more socially connected. We start to be And that's true in terms of of marriage. It's true in terms of church attendance. It's true in terms of social trust. It's true in terms of our involvement in community organizations, a steady rise. There's a little bit of a pause during the 1930s and 1940s, but coming out of the Great Depression and even before World War II, probably the greatest civic boom in American history in the 40s and 50s and 60s. Every organization in America was getting more members. Churches were packed. Kids, families were bursting the seams because that was the baby boom. Social trust was at an all-time high. And then suddenly, silently, mysteriously, beginning in the late 60s, suddenly all of those things began to go in the opposite direction. People stopped getting married so much. The social trust began to decline. Membership in organizations, church attendance, all these various measures of social cohesion began to decline steadily, almost in a linear fashion. You can see down during now, if you pause in 2000 just for a second, that's when I published a book called Bowling Alone, and said, well, but things are going downhill in terms of social cohesion. But then after I published Bowling Alone, the trend, and I didn't predict this, but there it is, a straight line ever since, down, down, down. Less strong family units, less social trust, less membership in organizations, less church attendance, and so on. And you can see now we're back actually about where we began 125 years ago. If we go quickly to the next slide, this is about cultural solidarity. This is the degree to which people feel that we're all in this together. And again, in just a second, Shaylyn will give you a sense of what it felt like actually at the time. But there was in that earlier period, down in around 1890, Americans did not have a sense that we're all in this together. They had a sense that everybody should take care of themselves and the devil take the hindmost. But then coming out of that period in around 1900, once again, you see an upturn. Not perfect. We don't overnight become togetherness, but we gradually move up. There's that same pause in the 1920s we talked about before, but then steadily, more and more focus on what we have in common, a greater and greater sense that we're together, a greater sense that we're kind of a we and not just a set of I's, I. And then you can see just about the same time that all the other curves began to go down, we suddenly stopped becoming quite so focused on what we had in common and began to focus more on our self-interest. And you can see the steady decline keeps going down through the 70s and 80s and 90s and 2000s, and it keeps dropping down further. And pause for a second. Around here is where Trump enters the picture. Now, Trump is the epitome of a narcissist, but he had nothing to do with this bigger trend. I mean, he represented it in an exaggerated form, but this is a good example of what I said earlier. This story shows that the events of the last 3 or 4 or 5 years have to be seen in the context of this much larger cycle trend. Now, if we put all these graphs together, well, let me pause for a second. Well, no, go to the next slide, please. The next slide just puts them all together. And you can see these are essentially, it's not lots of different graphs, it's the same graph. For economics and politics and social relations and culture, America began around the 1890s, 1900, as a very I country. But then gradually we became more equal, more cooperative politically, more socially connected, and more focused on what we had in common, more we. And that reaches a peak, and all these charts reaches a peak up in the, roughly speaking, 1960, and then begins the same, in all cases, this same long plunge down back toward an I society. If we have the next chart, this simply summarizes, this is one single graph that summarizes basically the empirical evidence from this book. It says America between 1890 and now went through a big, big swing from a very I society to midway through that period, a very we society, and then back down to an I society. And that poses a number of questions you might want to ask. Well, what happened up there at the top that caused it to change? We actually think that the more interesting question is what happened over at the beginning, but I'm going to let my partner and co-author, Shaylyn, step in now, pick up the story. And Shaylyn, what was happening over there at the beginning of this curve?
Yeah, I think that one of the most fascinating parts of this story is simply how similar a situation we're in today to the one that Americans found themselves in during the Gilded Age in the early 1900s in American history. I mean, you can see that reflected just in the hard data that this graph represents, right? We were in a remarkably similar place. And so, as Bob mentioned, it turns out that the more instructive moment of history here is not when we were at some supposed peak of our greatness um, in the 1960s, but rather the moment that we were in a similar situation, but managed actually to pull ourselves up and out of it and right the ship. And so that's actually the story of the upswing. It's not a make America great again thesis, looking back and harking back to some supposed golden age in American history. On the contrary, there's a lot that wasn't great about that peak of we in American society, and we'll get to that in a minute. But really, our book argues that if ever there were a historical moment whose lessons we need to learn, it's the moment when the Gilded Age turned into the Progressive Era in United States history, which again is that 1900 1910s period. So the question is, what happened? Um, and if we want to go to the next slide here, there's just a few lessons that we want to pull out from this historical moment. Now, the progressive movement, which is what came on the heels of this Gilded Age moment, was a very diverse movement. And it's really important to point out that we're not talking about progressive in the way that it tends to be used in America today. We often refer to that as the small p progressivism. Small p progressivism it refers really to the sort of leftmost end of the political spectrum in American society, right? That's actually not what we're referring to. The way that progressive was used to describe this historical period, or capital P progressivism, was something much more broad. It was actually not a partisan phenomenon. Historians have called this movement the progressive movement, so diverse as to be barely coherent. There were a lot of different people who were a part of it. There were a lot of competing factions, but really it was a group of people who were united by a compelling desire to repudiate the downward drift of our nation and a galvanizing belief in the power of ordinary citizens to do that. And so let's take a look at this period and see what we can learn. So one thing that I want to point out here is that, again, as Bob so well emphasized, this is really a really statistical story, not just a historical story. This is not just a history repeats itself sort of story. We can actually see in the data what turned and when. And so a lot of times people ask the question, well, what was the leading variable? If you knew what turned upward first, then you might be able to say, well, that was the thing that was driving everything. And that's the thing that we should focus on today, fixing it first. And then all these other measures or all these other phenomena will follow. And a lot of times people assume that the thing that switched first was economics, that we sort of started moving in a more equalized direction with progressive taxation or other mechanisms, and that brought us together as a society. It turns out that that's actually not true, that economics is a lagging indicator in this story, meaning that other things turned in an upward direction before we moved in the direction of greater and greater economic equality. And that's a really important lesson, because a lot of times social scientists tend to think that economics is what drives everything and the rest is sort of just details. And this story says that that's actually not the case. So the question then, of course, is, well, what is the case? Is there an indicator that we can point to that we know did turn first? Well, looking back this far into a statistical story is pretty hard to parse out. But what we think we can see in the data, and also that data is matched by the sort of cultural and historical record of this period, is that what came first in this period was a moral and cultural shift. As Bob mentioned, the Gilded Age was characterized in America by something called social Darwinism. It was this idea that Darwin's theory of the survival of the fittest, which he used to describe the natural world, there were a lot of people in American society who thought that theory was a great way to organize society as one giant competition. Only the strong will prevail, and everyone else just sort of is responsible for themselves, a highly individualistic, me first sort of, I'm not really worried about anybody else, it's not my responsibility type of a mindset. And then on the heels of that cultural moment in American history came a movement called the social gospel movement. And this was a movement that came mostly out of evangelical Protestantism, that started to look at the scriptures, actually started to look at Christian theology and say, even in Christian theology, we've gotten really hyper individualistic, and this is not actually the message that Jesus was intending for us to take from this. And they started to actually begin to develop a cultural narrative around society being oriented toward taking care of our most vulnerable, about not rights or what society can do for us, but duties and what responsibilities we might have to each other as citizens. And that started in religious circles, but really moved into a more broader cultural phenomenon. And the period was characterized by a real moral indignation. You might have heard of the muckrakers who went into the meatpacking districts and into the slums in this period and took pictures and wrote really graphic depictions of the underbelly of the Industrial Revolution, and exposing that to the eyes of people who really probably at the time didn't know that was happening. And that prompted a real moral indignation. But it was a moral indignation directed inward. Those are the words of a historian, Richard Hofstadter, who really tried to capture the idea that these progressives were not just about criticizing other people and excising, the guilty parties from our society, but rather questioning the ways in which they had been complicit in building this really unequal, really polarized, isolated society. So who were these people that were having these moral moments and moral changes of heart? Largely, they were really young people. This was a very youth-driven movement. The vast majority of progressive reformers were in their 30s or younger when they were doing their initial innovative work that drove this movement forward. And what were they doing? They were focusing on association. That's a term that these progressives use. It's a little bit maybe of an antiquated term. We might use relationship or connection or a different word today, but they were talking about, they had a belief in the power of bringing people together, particularly bringing people together across lines of difference. These were young people who were living in a totally changed world. Their parents had grown up in small towns, on farms, and there had been this huge demographic shift through the Industrial Revolution to bring people into the cities, these busy, commercially driven, isolated places where all the ways that we had of convening and experiencing community in our small towns just no longer applied to the new industrialized context. So these reformers were literally inventing new ways of bringing people together in a totally changed context. And those new ways of bringing people together created this civic boom. It created vast new stores of social capital that really fueled this upswing for decades. We know from Bob's work around social capital that social capital is a phenomenon that fuels a lot of other good things that we want for our societies. And that was something that these reformers really knew and captured. They really worked hard to build face-to-face ties among unlike groups. And one movement just to highlight out of this that was part of the progressives was the settlement house movement, which is one of my favorite aspects of the American progressive movement, but of course had its roots in British society. Jane Addams, the famous settlement house worker, the famous progressive in America, she had traveled to the UK and had visited Toynbee Hall, the first settlement house in the world, and thought that was a really captivating and compelling idea of bringing elite educated young men into what were called at the time the slums, to create relationships, not just to serve the poor, but to actually be in relationship with the poor and understand their lives and learn from them, as well as contribute to education for people in that situation. That was an incredible movement that was brought to the United States by the progressives. So there was a lot of focus on association building. Another thing that characterized this progressive movement was grassroots innovation. This was a moment when tons and tons of citizen innovation was happening. A lot of times if any of you on the call are familiar with the American progressive movement, you'll know that a lot of times in our popular historical narrative, we sort of focus on the big programs that came out of this period, the trust busting and the child labor legislation and even the national income tax, right? But those things, actually, the real story here is that those things came on the tail end of this period and were actually built upon local innovations, hyper local innovations that Americans were doing in what one progressive called the laboratories of democracy, the small towns, the small cities, the neighborhoods, the tenements. We were working with solutions that were very inventive and innovative, and were proven at the grassroots, and then sort of were brought up onto that federal level as bigger programs. That's true of a lot of things. One example of that is the American high school movement, which actually, the first public high schools in the world were actually invented by people in the American Midwest, in small towns, who noticed that their young people needed a secondary education to succeed. They banded together, passed local tax initiatives, created a public school for everyone in their town, and that went viral, and then ultimately became the this high school system that we have today, that was a huge driver of the prosperity that Americans were experiencing during this upswing. So another point to bring out about this last upswing in American history is that it wasn't driven by charismatic political leaders. Charismatic political leaders sort of spotted a parade that was already happening and then got out in front of it. And Teddy Roosevelt's a great example of that, right? He was a master coalition builder and really created a lot of programs and initiatives that garnered bipartisan support, but he was building on the work that grassroots organizers and innovators have been doing for decades. He really, he and leaders like him translated that popular uprising into policies and programs. So again, a lot of times we look for a charismatic national leader or a big national program that's going to solve all of our problems, but the history tells us here that those things come at the end of the story, not at the beginning. The final point that I want to make here is, we've highlighted a lot of really positive lessons from this progressive era in American history, and we've talked a lot about this we period where America was moving more and more in the direction of we. But that, of course, begs the question: well, what about the people who were left out of that we? That was a period in American history that corresponded with Jim Crow and a lot of brutal racial violence in America. And that is something, of course, that needs to be addressed when we're talking about lessons of this period. And so it's important to say that the we that we were building toward in this period was highly racialized, largely because many of these progressives who we laud as sort of righting the ship in American history were themselves racist. So today, a lot of the structural racism and structural inequality that we're dealing with was sort of knit into these programs and initiatives that the progressives set in order. They were experiencing a moral awakening, but the circle of their moral concern simply did not extend to people of color. And that is an extremely important lesson. The peak of American we that we were building toward was not a peak in the sense of how high we were able to go, or how high we wanted to go, or how, we didn't realize the full potential of the we, not anywhere close. We got a lot of things right. We got a lot of things wrong. And this is a really important thing to know. So when we're looking back on this period, asking how we might see another upswing in American history today, we know that it's going to have to be a moral and cultural movement. We know it's going to be highly youth driven. It's going to have ties and associations as a really important part of it. It's going to probably begin at the grassroots, and it will probably not have political leaders on the front end, but more likely on the back end. And it's going to have to take full racial, ethnic, and all other forms of inclusion as the main part of it, not just some sort of afterthought that can be kicked down the road yet again. And so these are some of the important lessons of the last upswing, and some of the things that we think we need to take on board if we as Americans and in other societies like Britain would like to see another upswing happen today. So if we can just go to the last slide, we'll leave you with one parting thought here. This is a quote from Teddy Roosevelt. He said, "The fundamental rule of our national life, the rule which underlies all others, is that on the whole and in the long run, we shall go up or down together. Whether we know it or not, whether we choose to believe it or not, we are all in this together." And what the upswing data really shows is that everything goes better when we lean into that we and lean into the power of that togetherness. And so that's what we wanted to share with you today. We're super excited to hear the thoughts and insights of the other guests who've been invited to this call. And we're so grateful that you've allowed us to just share some of these insights with you today.
Thank you so much, Bob and Shaylyn. That was tremendous. Having seen the presentation before and read the book, I still have a very strong, overwhelming sense that that's an upswing led by primarily younger people, innovating locally in association, valuing relationship and connection across lots of different boundaries and divides, still feels really incredibly energizing. We've got a number of people in the audience that I really wanted to ask to give their initial comments in brief reflections. They might choose to use that opportunity simply to ask a question, but I'd really welcome a few kind of reflections. So in our first, we're going to do that in two clusters. And in our first cluster, we've got Imi Kerr, Lord David Blunkett, Jane Caulfield, and Lisa Eggbiden. If you could be ready to turn on your cameras and microphones in a moment, I'll come to you each in turn. And I'd like to start with Imogen Kerr from Civic Square. I mean, I'm really interested in how this analysis lands for you and what it makes you think of in terms of the work that you do in Birmingham.
So I just wanted to say thank you so much for that. I feel quite a lot of pressure being the first one to speak after such a brilliant overview, and I'm just going to give a couple of minutes really of thoughts about what emerged for me. I think I really enjoyed the nuance of what you both presented around the upswing not being some kind of, you know, perfect utopia that we are trying to hark back to, which is definitely something that we experience a lot in the political discourse at the moment, and something that I've heard a chap called Alex Evans in the UK talk about a lot. This idea of threat perception drives us back to a time where things felt great and we desperately try and rebuild that. So I really enjoyed the sort of honesty around that. And I have to say, I'm just going to share a few thoughts of what I think we're experiencing here. I'm not going to go over the situation. I think we all know what that is, the highly polarized, highly unequal, deep breakdown of trust and all of that. But more as a sort of maybe describe myself as a civic innovator working at the neighborhood scale, I can really see that absolutely where plurality is celebrated, where there are safe spaces that make people feel confident that they can imagine different futures and they can work together in a way that isn't just one homogenous blob, but instead is as Shaylyn talked about, so diverse it's barely coherent, but at the same time it is also incredibly coherent, is what we're seeing in the work we're doing here at Civic Square. And we're thinking about it at a sort of what infrastructure is needed at a neighborhood level to unlock that. You know, maybe the Carnegie libraries or the schools example that you gave, or the Toynbee Hall example you gave is something really important. You know, it's been said that societies live or die by their infrastructure, and we think that there is typologies of infrastructure that can help unlock this civic boom. So I definitely resonate with a lot of the messages in the book. I think we're seeing it a lot all over the place in the UK, you know, to not only mention a few, but things like Participatory City, things like We Can Make in Bristol are finding these low-level, everyday, participatory, trust-building, bridging social capital type spaces that can allow that confidence and agency to really flourish. I think it's really good to hear about some of the key learnings and messages, and I've certainly appreciated them, especially the ones where, you know, politicians actually often step into building and stitching that narrative together. And I think a few times where we have seen politicians emerge and try to do that, there's actually been a massive backlash where often it's felt that they don't take into account the grassroots work that has been done to get to that position. And so I'm really appreciating that lesson because you're either contributing to the polarization or you're unlocking it and understanding that there are just certain inflection points that happen. And I think that's quite exciting and something for us to learn a lot from, given the social media kind of hyper responsive, often lack of nuance that happens. So overall, I have to say, incredible. Definitely some of the learnings that we're learning and seeing, and the upswing and civic boom that we definitely experience on the everyday. What I would say is the point that I said before about where I think we don't try and create these homogenous blobs of we, where there's like a lowest common denominator of what we all agree on, is where I see the most energy and excitement. Instead, a sort of plural, never-ending space where people can celebrate difference and culture and visions and plurality, and then find the spaces in which we all agree, or find shared spaces definitely seem to work lots. And just my last little point really is to say that I think it raises some key questions for me for us to have a continued discussion. Shaylyn talked to some of them. Is the constant boom and dip something to do with the fact that unless we deal with historical injustice towards huge populations, unless we center things like youth, race, gender, colonial violence, slavery, all of these different things, are we just doomed for a kind of another little upswing and then a crash because people feel unheard, and in that homogenous blob they just feel ignored? I'm interested in a couple of things about what that then looks like. There is some work happening in the UK called The Larger Us, which I'm quite excited about what that means for us to have a larger us. And finally, just a random question really, because it came into my head, but I really enjoy the work of Carlota Perez and the work she lays out around transition periods and huge periods of transition in society, economical, technological. She talks about us being in the midst of a huge transition, and I would really love to see some overlays of those maps to see what that might look like. So yeah, thank you very much for the lessons, and thanks for the invitation as well, Helen.
As always, the pressure of going first, but actually done really articulately and well. So thank you very much. And I am going to move us on a little bit, because I do want to make sure that people have opportunities to speak and also have questions. So just a reminder that if you do want to ask a question, it would be great if you could pop it in the chat box. Can't believe that there are none out there. But we're struggling to get hold of David a little bit. So what I'm going to do is ask Jaden and Lisa to come in. And I think just on your point on that kind of one of those middle points that you made, Imi, about actually it's happening already. That's so much going on here in the UK. I thought it would be pretty good to ask Lisa and Jaden from Kindle School, is a youth-led school that they're setting up, launching in September, just to show that this is a phenomenon that's happening all over the place, and perhaps later to reflect on what are the things that we can do to support that in terms of energy. But Lisa and Jaden, welcome. Thank you ever so much for joining us. We had a great chat yesterday, I know, and I would love to just hear from both of you briefly on really just a brief explanation about what Kindle is, why you're excited about it, why you set it up, and then just any kind of reflections or questions that you have for Shaylyn or Bob.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for that warm introduction. From what we've been able to gather already, there's clearly an evidence that shows that there's strength in numbers. And just to kind of set the tone of what Rekindle is all about, it's about unity, it's about togetherness. So me and Jaden will definitely be bouncing between the both of us rather than one dictating and then the next one going, to set the tone of what Rekindle is about. So Rekindle is a revolutionary initiative that is a supplementary school, and it's coming to South Manchester, fingers crossed, in September. Rekindle is all about helping young people that have disengaged with education fall back in love with it. I think right now, especially with the frequent changes that go on in the UK, it's becoming harder for young people to feel empowered within their school system, especially outside of their school as well, within the communities. So at Rekindle, what we aim to do is bring that back to life and bring the heart of education into young people's lives much more, as well as doing that, providing an education that resonates with them as an individual and respects and almost brings light to their culture and their individuality. So that's my sort of starter. If I'll pass it on to Jaden.
Thanks, Lisa.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are some really key issues here that are really important for Rekindle. And I was listening to that, I texted our CEO and I said we need to add more data into Rekindle, because I think that's the that we're missing. But Shaylyn touched on a really important point, and she said the more instructive moments are found in pulling ourselves out and right the ship. And that was what it was really about in terms of Rekindle. It was about finding that aspect of community that would help other young people better understand and better fall in love with education again. And I think that is where the education system has gone wrong for many people, especially in terms of the structural racism that we see and the class division and the North and South divide in terms of the education system in the UK. And it is a massive issue. And this is where Rekindle aims to kind of better that in terms of providing young people with the correct opportunities, despite socioeconomic groups or despite ethnic backgrounds, despite anything, any of the barriers that are set against them. And so I think it's really, really important that we have conversations like this and academic pieces like this that show the evidence that schools like Rekindle need to exist. And yeah, and I think that's kind of what we pulled from that, and the philosophy behind it is it's very similar to, I wrote some notes about it because at the minute I'm studying philosophy, and I came across Weber and his ideal types and social actions, and there were certain parts of association as ends of means that really tie into that, and this idea of social action and being a part of more of a group and understanding the verstehen behind people and what they actually do. On why they do certain things within the world, and that is really duty bound, and why we exist is to create certain pieces within the world.
Great, well, thank you very much. Bob and Shaylyn, I don't know whether you want to come back before on any of the comments that have been raised so far before we sort of open up a little bit more.
I mean, I'm so inspired by these stories just because, you know, a lot of times we do a lot of these talks and people say, oh, how surprising, you guys are optimistic. Most people aren't. And it's actually these young people and the initiatives that they're talking about that actually make us optimistic. And I just wanted to point out that a lot of times when we're looking at that national picture given to us by national news outlets or by national political parties or political candidates, there isn't a lot of reason for hope because it seems like nothing is changing, right? But then when you zoom down to that hyper local and you zoom down to the neighborhood level, which is where all of you are working, you can't help but be optimistic because there's absolutely so much going on. And I just want to say the work that all of you three are doing, which is digging deep on the question of how do we create community that both honors difference but is also coherent? I think that is the absolute most important work that can be done. That's the work that was never done in the progressive era, right? And it came back to haunt us in American history in a couple of different forms, right? One, in the sense that in the 1950s, right before we did the backflip into the downturn, there were a lot of people saying this community is very conformist. It's too Imandeep kept calling it the homogenous blob, right? There were a lot of cultural commentators questioning America at that peak of we and saying this is too conformist. This is not a we that's expansive enough to fit people of color, to fit people of different gender and sexuality differences, or immigrants, or you name it, right? And unfortunately, the reaction in America was actually to go to just get hyper individualistic, right? And that's a little bit of the story of our downturn, is that in questioning the homogenous blob of we-ness that we were in that moment, the solution that was proposed was to enter what Tom Wolfe, who was a cultural commentator in the 1970s, was the me decade. Instead of just we basically gave up on we and focused instead on me. And so I love the work being done by all of you to actually dig into the really hard question of how do we create a fully diverse, fully inclusive we? And that may need to be something dynamic, not just something static. And I love that. So thank you so much for doing that work.
And I think it leads us really nicely into a couple of comments and questions that have been made in the chat. And I'm not going to cite all of them, but there is something that I remember perhaps in a previous talk about where the kind of change happens. So you talk about culture and that kind of moral awakening being a lead factor, and actually economy lagging some way behind. That's fascinating. And so then it becomes a question of what are the dynamics that make those things happen. So are we talking about lateral kind of horizontal connections between lots of different places, or a kind of codependent arising of local change? Or is there mechanisms or ways, or ways we could look at things that happened perhaps in previous times in the US that show the connection of the macro to the micro, to the top, to the bottom, if you like? And someone else mentioning really about what the role of digital technology might be in this, in our kind of new upswing. In terms of that sort of terrain, what would you sort of respond with, do you think?
Well, I mean, gee, there's a lot. I mean, that a lot is packed into that set of questions. I do think, let me just pick out two. One is the role of moral reawakening, because we're in a sort of a society now in which people, quote, sophisticated people, are a little uneasy talking about morals, and certainly uneasy talking about religion. And that's even more true in the UK. I mean, in America, there are still serious people, me, for example, who feel comfortable talking about religion, because religion is still, after, even with all the recent declines, religion and moral talk is still acceptable, I would say, in the US. I don't know so much whether that's true in the UK. It's an important issue, not so much about the role of religion, but the role of being able to say with a straight face to somebody else who's doing something, or to yourself, or to the people that you're close to, you know, that's just wrong, morally wrong. That's what was the leading indicator the last time around. People had to be willing not just to make moral judgments about other people, but to make self-reflexive moral judgments about what they were doing and what they were doing wrong. And as I said at the outset, you know, this book was written before we had any idea of what was going to happen this year. There are some things that are happening this year in America. I don't know the UK. I mean, of course, I know the UK, but I don't know as well this year. There are some things happening in America today that, despite everything, actually are encouraging in this sense. That is to say, there has been an upswing in the involvement of American young people today that was not even visible a year ago when we wrote the darn book. But in fact, you know, it's life imitating art or something. That is what's happening now. And so, you know, you have Greta Thunberg, the young Swedish woman who's leading the world basically, but in America too, she's a powerful voice, a powerful moral voice. That's the point I'm trying to make, for the future, for her future, and against, you know, against global warming. And similarly, probably this has been known it's heard in the UK. We have a huge gun problem, of course, in America. That movement, the anti-gun violence movement, is being led now by young people who survived themselves, personally survived the shooting attack at the Dorothy Stoneman. I can never remember the name of the high school, but the Dorothy Stoneman High School in Florida. You'll all have known about that, and you probably will know that the people who are leading the most powerful moral voices in America on that issue are those kids. And there are many other examples of religious leaders in America today, especially among Black leaders who have historically Black pastors have been among the most powerful moral voices in America. So bottom line, I'm actually pretty optimistic about at least that part of it, the role of young people and the importance of having a moral awakening and not being embarrassed about talking about morals. In the end, unless we talk about what we actually morally owe to other people in an ought tone of life, not just an is, but an ought tone of life, I don't think we're going to make progress. I've rambled on a little bit, and I'm trying to avoid getting caught giving a sermon here on air.
That's completely fine. And I know that there's I would very much like to bring in Pat Kane at this point. Pat, are you there? Many of you will know Pat as an artist, a musician, an activist, a very good journalist. Are you here, Pat?
Hi, everyone. It's a great honour to meet you both, Robert and Shaylyn. I'm just to say, the thing I'm involved in is called the Alternative UK, which is another one of these platforms that's looking for political and community diversity and innovation. And the truth is, there's definitely a lot of it out there at the moment in the UK. But I wanted to ask you a question. I actually put a graph into the chat file, which is a graph that it charts cumulative carbon emissions from 1850 to 2015. And almost exactly at the same breakpoints as the we culture over the 50s, 60s, and 70s declines, up and accelerating from the mid 80s goes carbon consumption globally.
Right.
So that asks a question about the relationship between individualism and consumerism and consumerist identity and the structures that accelerate that. So that's one question. To think about that a bit. And then the second question was, you say very, very inspiringly in the book, crisis doesn't necessarily drive these shifts. You don't need a war for this to happen. And you sort of make that point around about the turn of the century. Now, could environmentalism be that non-crisis trigger? I mean, maybe it's more of an acute edge now because the biosphere disruption has become COVID. But in the run up to COVID and through Greta Thunberg and through the climate strikes, there was it's almost like a kind of the way that we dealt with the nuclear threat as exterminism. There was a sort of general anxiety. We must do something about this. The consensus of knowledge is too great. So do you think that environmentalism will be enough for this generation, this new set of social gospelers to come through? Or will it need something extra? And I'm wondering whether there's something extra, maybe something that's just bubbling that hasn't really come through yet, but which is to do with informationalism. You know, if the first wave was a reaction to the age of industry, will we get a reaction to the age of information? I mean, you know, we have the tools to manage groups and consensus and educate ourselves beyond our wildest dreams in the 60s counterculture. What are we using them for? Toxic polarization and self-destruction. Right. So that might be another fuel in the tank of the new social gospelers. One last point, how anarchist or autonomist should these bottom-up groups be given the general disillusionment with political representation, both in the US and in the UK? I mean, how much do they have to use all this fantastic energy, food, information tech to kick themselves off, to set an exemplar and then wait for and then talk to government, but not until something's really underway from the get-go, because you've just gone through an election where 50% of your electorate doesn't believe in the system. So how autonomous and even anarchist, social anarchist, does this bottom-up activity have to be? Thank you very much. A delight to be part of this.
Well, there are a ton of things that need to be answered in what you said, Pat. Lots of really, really good thoughts. And I'm going to just be very brief, but say a couple of things. And then Shaylyn, I know you have things you want to say too. So let me talk first a little bit about the environmental issues, global warming especially, and the pandemic. It's worth noting that both of those are the ultimate we problem. That is to say, you're not going to. It's a prisoner's dilemma. I would love it if you would do the hard work of cutting back on your pollution, please, and I would enjoy that would end global warming or slow global warming. And of course, you have the same thing. It's a classic prisoner's dilemma, and the only way you can get out of a prisoner's dilemma, I mean, I'm summarizing a ton of social political theory here, is if you have a sense of we. If I generally worry about your well-being and you generally worry about my well-being, and therefore we can take action together to solve a problem that neither of us could solve separately. And the same thing is not an accident. The same thing is true for the pandemic. Because of this particular virus, I am better off if you wear a mask, please. And I would, but I don't have to wear a mask. I mean, I would just love to be able not to have the mask in front of my face all the time. You're in the same boat, right? You would prefer to have me wear a mask and protect you, and then you wouldn't have to worry about you wearing a mask. It's just the same. The problems I think that we're facing today, the real existential problems we're facing today, are both of the big ones. The pandemic, which is of course a short-run thing, and the global warming, which is definitely not a short-run thing. Both of those are problems you can't solve if you have a purely individualistic point of view. There are a lot of other things you said that I would love to talk about. And just one quickly, I will just pick one more quickly, and then I will turn over to Shaylyn because she has, I'm sure has, I mean, I'm not patronizing her. I know she will have a lot of good ideas to add. You said maybe we should just let the local groups be autonomous or maybe even anarchic, and instead of responding to national or still yes, just following the orders of people at the top. That if that were the choice, that's you were making the right choice, bottom up, not top down. But it's important that those are not the only choices. There are also lateral connections, and in the American case, I'm talking now about the real history of that progressive period. The most interesting thing was not either just bottom up or top down, but laterally, people in Toledo getting some good idea that really was a good idea, and people in Houston or Galveston learning about that idea, and it spread laterally and like wildfire. That's the way the high school, we didn't emphasize, Shaylyn did mention it, it's a huge deal. The first time in world history that every kid in town was guaranteed 4 years of secondary school. Think of what was happening in England in 1910, that period. In America, small towns all across the country were guaranteeing every kid 4 years of free secondary education. And that idea, which was a great idea, and it happened in East Elbow, Iowa, went viral. Didn't have a national, didn't come from Harvard, didn't go to Harvard, didn't come from DC, didn't go to, eventually it went to DC. But the virality occurred as the folks in East Elbow talked to the people in Houston or in Sacramento or all these places all across America. So, and I will say one last thing because it came up earlier. That's the way it happened in Britain the last time. I promised I was not going to talk much about Britain. That was the role of Manchester. Above all, I know Manchester pretty well, actually. And the good ideas of that mid-Victorian social reform movement did not eventually got to London, but they were mostly people in local places like Manchester that were spreading. That was municipal socialism, right? That embodies exactly the same thing that I'm talking about. So those kids at the school, they are living in the very place where a lot of important innovations came the last time Britain went through this kind of a cycle. Shaylyn, I'm sorry I monopolized the time.
No, not at all. I mean, you're right. We could do an entire hour-long conversation around those questions that you raised because they're very exciting and very interesting. So I'm struggling to pick one or two things to bring out, but I do think that you bring out the idea of consumers, right? And the rise of consumerism and the rise of, and whether that correlates with this I thing. Absolutely it does, right? And I think what's so interesting is what we need is a moral awakening, largely because economics has become our morality in America, right? And that's actually true of the social Darwinism. That is what social Darwinism is the idea that competition is a form of morality and it's completely fine, right? And so I do think that the moral reimagining is going to ultimately inform our economics, right? And help us rethink the idea that all we are in the world is consumers, right? Or all we are in the world is capitalists trying to amass wealth, and that's sufficient. And I do think that you mentioned technology as well. I was just on a call yesterday with some leaders in the tech industry in the United States, and there's a real sense that, not widespread yet, but among small groups of tech innovators, there's a real recognition of a need to build technology out of our moral values, rather than trying to impose moral values on technology that already exists, right? So we need to actually sort of clear the slate a little bit and say, wait, what are our moral values first? And then how do we build technologies that help us live into those values? It's too hard to, after a Facebook is built, go back and say, oh, whoops, like this should have been a place that respects diversity or whatever it is, right? And so I'm really, I do think that there are lots of signs of hope here. So much to say. I just, Thomas Friedman had a great column in the New York Times yesterday that I would point people to, where he talks about when you start to politicize Mother Nature, that's the beginning of the end, right? And so climate change is the ultimate we issue. But if we continue in this sort of bellicose need to use climate crises as a bludgeon to prove our own rightness, we're not going to get anywhere. And that's a moral issue, right? Do we take these signals that Mother Nature are giving us and turn them into moral self-reflection? Or do we just use them as a way to punish others in this zero-sum game? These are all questions that have a moral reflection at their heart, at their core. That is not a surprise given what we see in the historical period. We need to lean into that and let it take us where we need to go. That's my opinion.
Amen to that. Thank you, Shaylyn. I think we could go in any number of directions. I'm really conscious that Michael Bonner's raised a really interesting point in the chat around what the role is really of national, regional and local government in kind of creating that. And actually what you've brought in there is a kind of, you know, that kind of commercial shift from the consumer to the citizen, which is very much kind of John Alexander's work as well. But I wanted to bring in Nick Hurd. Nick, welcome and thank you so much for joining us. You were Minister for Civil Society 2010, 2014, and your work post-government is still really focused on supporting young people, social action, investing with social purpose and also moral mission. I wonder if you had some comments or questions that you'd like to share.
And thank you so much. And Bob, thank you for some amazing brain food.
Thanks, Nick. It's good to see you again.
It's really. Can I make just perhaps two very quick reflections? I'm really clear lots of people want to come in. The first is around the question you asked, Helen, where the leadership comes from. Now, I obviously bear the scars of being the minister that led a lot of the work when the last time a British Prime Minister stood up and said, I want to reinforce the we, I want to build civil society. And politically, it was a failure because we failed to build some trust around it. But those scars kind of reinforce the view I think you were putting across, powerfully around where the charismatic leadership comes from, and perhaps it's the politicians that come in at the end rather than the beginning of this journey. That resonated with me. But my reflection is around association. And Bob, actually, coming out of another book of yours, Our Kids, and the picture you painted of children being brought up in separate but unequal worlds. And I worry about that in this country. Now, I saw it in my constituency for 14 years. I see it elsewhere. And therefore, I just wanted to reinforce the point that I think Imi and Lisa and Jaden and others were making about the importance of creating space where young people from different backgrounds who would not otherwise meet can spend time together doing things together that are constructive, that help them build confidence and voice, that develop their sense of being an active citizen, build trust by doing things together. Everything that you've written about very powerfully. Now, I'm sorry we've lost David Blunkett, but he's a Labour politician and I'm a Conservative politician. We worked together on just such a programme, it's called National Citizen Service, which was set out to try and create that space for young people who would never otherwise meet, to come together and spend time together in that kind of association. And we don't have enough of that in this country. And as we talk about the rebuild and the Great Reset, I'd be very interested in your observations on that and whether there's anything that we could learn from the States in that regard.
Well, Nick, it's great to see you. And I am very disappointed in what happened the last time the UK government took seriously this issue. Probably not as disappointed as you are, but I'm still very disappointed. And we've run in both countries, have run into a series of leaders, and I don't see the end of the series in the US of very much I-focused leadership. Don't get me started on that. So the question you ask, I guess, is, well, are there any good ideas from the US with respect to young people and their working together? I don't immediately think of a particular example, although Shaylyn probably could. I want to make just a quick reference, however, to a closely related thing, which is using the internet as a way of making connections as a form of association, maybe instead of face-to-face connections. That's what people, after the book I wrote, Bowling Alone, a lot of people said, well, okay, we don't have bowling leagues, but we've got Facebook. That's going to solve our problems. Well, that turned out not to be true. Facebook did not solve all of our problems. But the main thing we learned from that, this is the thing I want to emphasize, well, there are probably two things, but the main thing we learned from that is it's wrong to ask the question, we're asking about association and connections among people. It's wrong to think that there's a dichotomy. Either we can have face-to-face ties or we can have virtual ties, because nowadays almost all of our ties are simultaneously both. That is to say, the people that I'm most likely to meet on email are the people that I know best in real life, or at least did until the pandemic. And the people that I hang out with virtually are also people that I meet. And that's not just true of an old guy like me, it's true of my grandchildren. I've got 7 grandchildren, fortunately, and they're all, in their teens and 20s. And I surveyed them, and they're on the internet all the time. But the people they meet on the internet are people that they also know offline. So these are mixtures. We should be thinking in terms of the kinds of mixtures of face-to-face and virtual ties. Shaylyn, help me. What's the alloys? An alloy is a combination of 2 different metals. So you take bronze, copper and tin. You put them together and you get bronze or something. That's different from either of the 2 metals taken separately. And we have different alloys, and the alloys that we ought to be working, alloys, but that is mixtures of face-to-face and virtual real ties. And the alloys, this maybe sounds too academic to phrase it, but it's not academic at all. We ought to be thinking of ways of new alloys, that is, ways in which we can use internet connections to strengthen and reinforce real face-to-face ties, not looking for some perfect virtual connection, virtual world is going to solve all of our real world problems, but we also can't write off the virtual. It's an added tool for building connections, face-to-face connections, not an alternative to face-to-face connections. Does that make sense, Nick? It's not directly relevant, but it is relevant to where we ought to be looking. We ought to be looking in making these associations, especially trying to reach young people, not just as some virtual place that they should gather, but at some virtual place that will connect them to each other in real ties, real face-to-face ties.
Great, thank you, Bob. We're on the last sort of 10 minutes now. Just on a personal.
Is it true, by the way, that David Blunken is no longer on?
He was here, and then he had some technical difficulties, and then I believe he's now left, which is a great shame. Aldous, if he is here, you can ping me a message, and we'll bring him back in.
I know David very well, and I wanted to say, and this I can say even with him not here, I spent a lot of time hanging out with David when he was Home Secretary, I think at the time, in the 70s, I guess. I'm so old that I remember. And he was at that time the most far-sighted communitarian on either side of the Atlantic that I met. He and I spent hours in his office. I remember this in his office at the Home Office, talking about what we could do. He was one who was going to do it. He was asking my thoughts, to bring people together, even in the face of crises that he saw before anybody else in the British political elite did, having to do with immigration and diversity and those sorts of issues. So David is it's easier for me to say this when he's not on, actually. David is a national treasure in the UK, and I desperately hope that you guys are making good use of him still.
Yes, we will absolutely pass on this bit of the recording, if nothing else, to David. Let him know his adoring audience what you feel about him. I can completely agree in so many ways. And I think just to join on this sort of previous conversation around technology, there really is so much more work to be done to understand what our social digital infrastructure is that creates better ties between sort of different kinds of people in different and the same places. I just wanted to, I know that I would love to draw in Catherine Howe, who works at Adder and Worthing Council. I know you had a question about participation and democracy. I just wanted to make sure that we had time to explore that a bit. Catherine, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you. And it's such a rich conversation. It is difficult to think exactly where to locate a question. But the thing that's really striking me is the question about how we help the democracy and the process of decision making evolve in order to really embrace the participatory action that we see. I'm so inspired by the kind of work that IMI does in Birmingham, stuff that's going on in Dudley, things that I see in Bristol. However, if we don't find a way of bridging between that participation and the representative democracy that we're currently stuck in, in terms of that kind of like that sort of like big systemic decision making, then it's very difficult to see how you bring about that upswing without a huge amount of conflict. And I suppose it's a question about that kind of like that democratic evolution living alongside the social evolution. And do people see, you know, particularly from Bob and Shaylyn, a reason for hope in that? Can we see the seeds of hope in that kind of transition as well?
Shaylyn, would you like to pick that up? Comment.
I mean, I thank you for bringing that out, because I agree. We can create all this amazing stuff happening at the grassroots, but if there isn't a way actually for that to translate upward, then that it creates a ton of disillusionment and despair, right? And that fuels the mistrust in institutions and in governance. And so I think that's a huge risk. And do I see seeds of hope? I'm not sure I do yet. And maybe again, I just would say, maybe I'd frame my answer this way. It's important to remember when we're looking back to this historical period that it unfolded over 60 to 70 years.
Right.
So we talk about the last upswing, we talk about the progressive era as being this great, amazing movement, but it's important to remember that not everything changed overnight. A lot of those reforms that were put in place took decades to play out. And the reason that I say that is because what we're really looking for right now in the United States, as well as in Britain, is a pivot. And remember that a pivot, you're actually standing in the same place. Before you were facing one direction and you have this realization that you need to face another direction, but you're still in the same hole that you were in, 2 minutes before. It's a matter of redirecting your energy toward climbing out of that hole rather than digging it deeper, right? And so it's important, I think, especially for young people, and I'm one of them. I'm not that young, but I'm young enough to have only lived during the downturn of this story. And things have only gotten worse during my lifetime. And that's true of people younger than me as well, and more true. There's a lot of urgency, like we have to change it now, and we do have to change it now. But it's important to realize that when you're talking about changing society, when you're talking about changing representative democracy to something more participatory, that's going to take a while to play out. And so we do need to make sure that we're not being impatient, and realizing the enormity of the task ahead of us means that we need to take that long range view and realize that, those of us, those young people who are working today, they may not see the fruits of their labors immediately, but it's about getting more and more people surrounded, facing in that new direction, putting their energy toward it. Does that make sense? I worry that young people today want sort of instant change. And if they don't see it, then it turns into massive disillusionment. And that's what I would just caution against. One of the lessons of the upswing is that when you're trying to make big, large scale, lasting change, it takes a while to unfold. And the type of change you're referring to with change in our very political system itself, that's maybe the biggest kind of change of all. That and maybe economics, I don't know.
Yes, and I think that question, how do we maintain, if we're looking at decades long of change and things that we need to go through, where does our energy and our momentum and our commitment and our kind of holding of that vision really come from, and how do we feed each other with that? Again, speaking to kind of the connections between people being important. And I've just seen that there are people chatting to each other in the chat who think that they're sending private messages, but they're not, which gives me hope that there might be some space for the conversations that we have afterwards. I am going to draw us to a natural close. I think I'd like to ask Bob or Shaylyn maybe just to make any final comments to this, what has been an incredible contribution from a brilliant number of people. But is there any sort of parting shots you would share with us before we leave you this evening?
I'll channel Shaylyn because I know she would say the same thing that I'm about to say. If there's one single lesson that we learn from that earlier period in American history, it is the jargon, academic jargon for it is agency, which means only we can make a difference. We are not living in a deterministic world in which we are fated, that our fate has been determined by things that happen to you. You could easily think, if you're a young person today, well, look, my whole life, it's been just downhill. I don't even know if it's ever been different. And I have no reason for thinking that it could be different. And the point of our book is to say, yes, there were people just like you who were caught in a situation just like this. And they made it different. They made it different because they recognized that they faced a choice, and they actually talked about this. They could go with the flow, assume that they were victims of the long waves of history, or they could actually try to move in a different direction. They could drift. This was the title of one of their books. They could drift with the flow, or they could try to master the current and turn the country in a different direction. That was not determined that it would move in a different direction. They made it move in a different direction. That is to say, they, by their actions with one another, they actually did change the direction in which America would otherwise have been headed. And that same thing is true today. And I'm now at the verge of giving a sermon to my grandchildren. Look, I know that you've been given a terrible set of circumstances. The great inequality, murderous polarization, self-centeredness, and so on. And yet you could make a difference. I'm speaking to my own grandchildren and the people of their age across the UK and the United States. It won't happen with if you don't step in, it won't happen. But if you do step in together, it can happen. And that's just not my blowing smoke. Look at the evidence. These people before, just like you, did change the direction of our country for most of us, for the largest lion's share of a century. So raise your eyes, be optimistic, but not just, Putnam says, feel good about life. I'm not saying that. I said, look at the evidence. They did make a difference by their choices and their actions. And you can too. I'm sorry, I get carried away a little bit.
And I'll just join the sermon for just a moment to say, another way of thinking about we is thinking across generations. We are building something that needs to outlast ourselves, and that is something that we are gifting to future generations. I think that climate activists really harness this idea well. And I think we need to harness that idea in multiple different domains that we're working. And speaking of multiple different domains, I'll just say that follow your passion. There isn't one issue that needs to be worked on. This needs to be an incredibly diverse movement. This isn't just going to be a political movement. It's not just going to be an economic movement. It's going to be a movement that has cultural aspects to it, that has political aspects to it, economic aspects to it. Work on the problems right outside your own doorstep that keep you up at night. And when we engage all of our agency in that way, not agency is about embracing our own power, but it's also embracing our own passions and what we're good at and what we really want to pour our lives into. And when we do that and start to live out of our own values, I think that we can see a tipping point of change when more and more of us begin to do that. And when we do that, it inspires others to do that. And I think that young people today are great at that. Lean into it more, get more of your peers to do it with you. And that's where the hope is going to come from.
Thank you so much. So it's the end. I have to say at some point, do buy the book if you haven't read it. It's a cracking read. If you do want to carry the conversation, join the lobby. You're going to be automatically pinged over to there. If you do decide to stay, and you'll see options for joining the bar, the lounge, the kitchen. Do subscribe to our newsletter if you want to know when the next event is taking place. But finally, if everybody just take themselves off mute and show their faces, which would have been so lovely to see you all. If you're also on, take yourselves off mute, let's try and give a massive, huge round of applause and generous thank you to Bob and Shaylyn and all of our speakers. Thank you so much.
Hooray!
And good night.